Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Episode 5, Challengers of the Status Quo. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, it's been an interesting week, both in retail and in our lives, as we've had lots of great conversations this week, both in and around retail. You and I were chatting about off mic about Shop Talk. There's Shop Talk meetings going on. And we had a great discussion with Deborah Weinswig, who is our special guest in this episode, coming up later. She's done such a great job of establishing herself and her practice really as focus on expertise. So we thought that would be a great addition to this particular episode.
Yeah, I think over the last probably 5 years or so, Deb and Coresight have been a great resource on technology, a lot of what's going on in China in particular, innovation category. I mean, you name it. She has a great perspective and her firm's got a lot of great information. So
this idea, the challenges of the status quo, you start out by talking about a whole bunch of things. And you know, as we dig into the themes of remarkable retail, how do companies respond to disruption? We've never been, of course, arguably in a more disruptive time than we are now, for good or ill. And I guess that's also a good thread for the rest of our narrative for the rest of the season one and beyond. But yeah, why do you think in general companies have difficulty transforming? I mean, you and I, again, we're talking off mic, these big companies are filled with very smart people.
Sure.
Who can see these things coming, but yet somehow for a mix of reasons, they just don't. Is it speed? Is it it's not going to happen to me? What do you think holds them back?
A lot of reasons, I guess maybe all the above. One of the things I get into in the book a little bit, and I've used over the years, is this idea of trying to understand whether the issue is awareness, is the issue acceptance of a new reality, is the issue the failure to act. And what I've seen, my own direct experience, but working with clients, studying clients, is there's issues at any of those stages. I think it's absolutely the case, and I know we talked about this on an earlier episode, that there are plenty of companies that have done their homework, that have smart people, they know what's happening, or they know they're at risk, but they fail to act. And I think that's often an issue of culture and not having, either that you're afraid you're going to get fired or be humiliated or get your bonus or whatever. So you're wired to say no as opposed to wired to say yes. But I do think more and more is that there are companies that actually aren't as aware as they should be, or they don't fully accept how profound the change is. One of the things we've seen in the COVID crisis is obviously this move towards more digitally driven shopping channels, more e-commerce and so forth. But most of those trends were already happening well before this particular crisis. And as probably comes up every episode, we've seen them all accelerate. Yeah. But a lot of these companies really should have acted in this direction many years ago, not because, there might be a pandemic someday, but because that's what was necessary to keep pace with consumers and was necessary to stay competitive. I do think that there oftentimes maybe is a conventional wisdom of how to look at customer data, or they just are too locked into what business they're in, maybe, that they don't consider new sources of competition. But I am thinking more and more, it's not just a cultural issue. It's actually seeing what's going on and really accepting the degree to which it will change the playing field.
It's like in our first episode, we were talking to Sucharita about curbside, and she said, well, listen, and finally the Department of No or whatever got in the way of that has gotten out of the way. And, now that these organizations have moved on things in weeks, not years, they were ready to do it. But as you said, there was some kind of intransience there. And it kind of guides us over to this idea that you start chapter 8 out with, the optimizing to extinction, which I kind of love that idea, both from my background and from observations, with that Hemingway quote, when one character asks another how he went bankrupt, and gradually and then very suddenly. It's one of my favorite quotes of all time, just because it's just so true.
Well, and remember, I guess I should point out that I wrote that before the COVID crisis. I was noticing what I think I refer to at some point in the book as the drip method of irrelevance, which is what's the cliche, the frog boiling in water. That these changes, these weaknesses tend to happen gradually over time, and they get to this critical point. And I think we have absolutely seen that time and time again. I think what's different even before the COVID-19 crisis is that the change has become more exponential rather than linear. And I think as human beings, we just, have a hard time, unless you're an epidemiologist or somebody, really understanding how dramatic change can be as you start to get up that scale curve.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Do you genuinely think the pace of change has accelerated? I mean, you hear it all the time, whether it's, Moore's Law or whatever, that, when we started our careers, there was change. Do you genuinely think the pace of change has those cycles have gotten larger and swifter? And if so, what do you think drives that? Is it technology? Is it consumer behavior? Like, what is it that fundamentally has accelerated, to use that phrase another way, this notion that you're saying that the death by 1,000 cuts can happen super fast, and in those cuts can be massive suddenly versus little nicks?
Well, I certainly think that technology is a big part of it. And Moore's Law is kind of at the heart of that, because processing power just keeps largely exponentially increasing. And so what that allows, whether you're in the data mining business or targeted marketing or whatever, the cost of and the speed of being able to perform certain functions is just dramatically gotten faster, cheaper, et cetera. So that's a big part of it. The other big part, I think, more from the consumer side that's enabled by technology is the degree to which we're all connected. I know we're going to talk about that in a future episode. Mm-hmm. The way information moves between and among people is really different than it was 10, 15 years ago. Whether it's the news cycle or you could pick almost anything, but also your ability to get access to prices and reviews and things like that. So the information flow, as well as the sheer amount of information, is literally exponentially greater than it was just a few years ago. So I think you do see this more of an exponential progression in all things data, technology related for the most part. And then similarly in terms of information and choice as it relates to the consumer. And I think it's just very hard to really get your head around how different things can be in only 2 or 3 years, separate and apart from the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic has collapsed these timeframes even more.
It connects to something else you said. Bailing water doesn't fix the hole. It leads me to ask, when you observe companies working on the wrong thing, is it a matter of we picked the wrong thing and events transpire so quickly that we picked the wrong thing and we can't change course and pick the right thing, or we're just too focused on picking that thing and you work on the wrong problems? What's some examples that you've seen of working on that kind of wrong problem?
Well, sometimes I think it's a business definition problem. So one of the examples is if you were in the selling coffee through the grocery store business, you thought about what made sense for you to get into based upon basically selling packaged goods through grocery stores, warehouse clubs, et cetera. And then along comes Starbucks and a gazillion independent coffee shops. And they create all the value in the last 2 decades in the coffee business. I think you can definitely get things wrong because you don't think about what the customer is trying to do, the solution. You define it by a product category or a distribution strategy. So I think those kinds of mistakes get made all the time. So you're really not framing the problem in the right way. The more perhaps straightforward example in the case of, say, department stores, they have to figure out how to grow revenue, and they don't really understand how to become more relevant to the consumer. And you get to this weird point, because it's become more common, but this vexing point where since you haven't figured out how to grow revenue, the only thing you can work on is lowering cost or closing stores. So that's what I mean by bailing doesn't fix the hole. If the fundamental problem is you're not relevant and remarkable enough, closing stores does nothing to make you more relevant and remarkable. It may give you some more cash flow or stop the money going out the door. But the underlying issue is that your brand isn't sufficiently relevant. Your business model is broken. And I don't ever remember customers saying, well, what would be great is if you made stores less convenient for me and had less service. Like that would be the thing that would make me start shopping at JC Penney or whatever.
Right. But nested in with that, there is, and again, we actually talked to Deborah about this. There is the idea that you've just got too many stores because channel shifting. Now we're talking business, not consumers, but more people are shopping online. Therefore, you may not need the same number of stores. Now that doesn't, as you say, fix your brand problem, but it does realign the fleet, as I've once described, right? A thing I've been thinking about a lot, what are the lasting implications of the COVID crisis? And one of the lasting implications may be the way we work. and the implications on, therefore, the number of people that go into a downtown or an office building. So you just may have all the stores in the wrong place now. We'll see how that all sorts out. But, there are some, I think, exogenous things that happen that say, I got to close. I've just got too many stores. I got to close them. Aldo talked about that when they went into protection. They were already in the process of, listen, we got too many stores. There's more stuff being sold online.
Well, you have, I think you have a few factors there, right? You have chains that have just kind of what I used to like to call overshot the runway. They thought they needed so many stores and they just went beyond the point where that made sense. You've got changing shopping patterns. Shopping mall that was great 20 years ago, for whatever reason, no longer is great. You get
retailers who open stores as a proxy for growth. Our friends at Kid and Ace were kind of a bit of a poster child for that. Let's get big fast. Let's open up.
Well, there's certainly pressure from investors, whether it's publicly or publicly traded or private, to push the envelope on growth. Yeah. And so you can easily overshoot the runway, or just over time, you need different locations, different size or whatever. But certainly the growth of e-commerce generally suggests you need fewer stores, or you could be more efficient in delivering to customers. But I think you still have to figure out if you can be just as relevant or even more relevant by reconfiguring your store fleet, whether that's fewer, different, smaller, whatever.
Do you like what Nordstrom is doing with they're opening these small stores that function as pickup and drop off locations, which made me think of something you said last episode, like BOPUS only works if you have a store.
Right.
But the stores perform a different function. Do you like that as a response to their trying to be more relevant and more customer focused from their
I do. And I've worked on a similar kind of effort a few years back. And what our orientation was, how do we grow share of wallet with our most important customers on a trade area or market by market basis? And how do we grow overall share in the market in the categories in which we want to compete? And I'm assuming, I haven't worked with Nordstrom specifically on this, but somewhat similar retailer. And when you dig into it and you understand why you're not getting more share of wallet, what you often discover is convenience is a big factor. And I think in the case of Nordstrom, they don't have that many stores in a given city. So if you want to get order pickup or return something, it'd be a heck of a lot more convenient to do it close to your home or close to your office on your way to getting your kids or whatever, rather than have to go to the big mall and deal with traffic and go to the third floor or what have you. So it seems to me like that's rooted in thinking about what success looks like separate and apart from the channel distinctions. And it's rooted in understanding what will create customer share of wallet and loyalty, and then redeploying your assets against that. I fundamentally like it.
Take that to its natural or unnatural or supernatural conclusion. If you're Nordstrom, should you just not open up a bunch of drive-thrus? And how do you square the brand Nordstrom with the convenience that customers are looking for? So I could imagine a world where the brand experiences, drive-through, returning stuff, go. I think you might see more of that, by the way, post-COVID. Can you square those circles where you've got a brand that is a prestige luxury, yet it looks like a Starbucks drive-through? Can you take it that far, or is there a point at which you'd like, that's not us? We'll be convenient in our way. Like, how do you think about that?
I think generally you have to think, if you're got one strong kind of brand equity, I think you have to think about which format really is kind of the core or the center of the ecosystem of your brand. And at least the way I think Nordstrom's understood today, it's certainly about certain breadth and depth of assortment, shopping environment, personal service. And so I think at the core, you would need flagship stores. But I certainly think you could add, for lack of a better term, satellite locations, which could be drive-through. They could be cosmetics only. Like, I don't know enough about what their internal data says.
Sure.
But I think you could certainly imagine if our goal is to own the accessible luxury customer, or however they would define it in LA, what configuration of physical assets do we need enabled by technology and e-commerce to make that happen? And you'd have to obviously sort out the economics and particular locations of all that. But yeah, I think so. I think you just don't want to have the tail wagging the dog, right? I mean, if you don't have what ultimately makes Nordstrom as an overall brand remarkable, then I think it would start to diffuse your efforts. But I could certainly see that. And I think we're going to see more of a hybrid model of particular retail stores that'll be more servicing curbside pickup and that sort of stuff. But I think we'll also see more of these kind of mini formats or local formats or whatever you want to call them to reduce physical capital and get closer to customers fundamentally.
Well, and or reduce friction in the modern world, whatever that looks like. You know, right. Apple's doing some work. You know, the typical Apple experience, if you're picking up in store, you got to weed your way through all those people and you got to find a blue shirt with a thing and they go and fetch your thing for you. And now they're looking at speed checkout, basically. So you go to a specific place and get your more Best Buy-ish, where you go to a specific place, signed, to pick up your item. And you know, that's just them, I think, flexing what their brand and what that means. So it's an interesting, a next gen, so to speak, of exploration and experimentation. Well, listen, let's bring on Deborah, because she makes up a lot of these same points. Let's bring her on.
Well, we're excited to welcome Deb Weinswig to the podcast. I've known Deb for a number of years and have benefited greatly from her insights. And she is the CEO and founder of Coresight Research. So welcome, Deborah.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So before we jump into the questions that we have for you, could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and some of the work that you do at Coresight?
This idea around Coresight ultimately is really rooted in research and studying not only customer behavior on a global basis, you know, the role of physical retail, the role of the, you know, kind of real estate on the technology horizon. What are we seeing and what's important to remember from the past? You know, as 2020 has evolved and even before then, we've done a lot of, you know, kind of advisory work, and whether that's, you know, kind of repositioning a brand, helping companies, you know, kind of from a global, you know, kind of cross-border perspective, or, you know, kind of doing kind of digital transformation and whatnot. That's kind of where we've been from an advisory perspective. And then one of my favorite areas is what we call innovator intelligence. And this is really helping startups, both big and small, young and old, not only tell their story, but in some cases helping to thread their story, because there's all this amazing technology. And not only figuring out who might be, you know, kind of the best to consume it, also what does that look like, and other partners that the innovators might want to work with. And then some of the really interesting projects we've done has been, you know, kind of those startups who are pre-revenue but have raised money and really helping them kind of chart their course. And so it's, you know, kind of truly taking what I learned as a sell-side analyst at Citi and in some ways just applying it to the startup world. And of course, events right now, digital events are kind of how we're all staying connected and probably increasingly important. We, you know, our heritage, Steve, as you know, is from the East, having spent many years in kind of Greater China, working with Li and Feng on the sourcing side, and, you know, kind of better understanding, you know, retailers and both online and, you know, kind of their physical presence.
Because you've had such broad experience globally and across a lot of categories, and as you said earlier, working both with startups and bigger companies, what do you think really separates those companies that are really able to innovate consistently, not just in a crisis, but really are able to challenge the status quo, as we're calling this episode, and really break through to the other side? And maybe you could even touch on your experience in China, because I think, you know, what's gone on there, as you know, what they call new retail is incredibly fascinating for most markets.
Yeah. And I mean, and the interesting thing is to kind of pick up at the end there, Steve, right? I mean, new retail, the fundamentals, you know, if we want to kind of strip it down, it's really all about best in class supply chain, logistics, you know, getting product to the customer when they want it, where they want it, how they want it, right? If you're in an office and, you know, you forgot your tie, you spilled on your shirt, right? They can have a new item to you in 30 minutes. You feel like when you're shopping, you know, digitally, that you're like literally inside a video game. You know, when you look at the stats around the daily visits to, you know, specifically Taobao, which is, right, the Alibaba platform, it's like 8 visits per day. And I think that's, you know, trending up to 9, and an average of almost 27 minutes spent on the app every day, because it not only does the kind of AI, right, foundation, right, everything's tailored specifically to you, but it's also this idea, right? It's, you know, I'm learning, I'm seeing, I'm considering. And I've always said that in China, right, shopping is a sport. It's a sport where, you know, theoretically everybody can win, which is fabulous. But there is this, you know, it's this fun, and it's in some ways always on. You know, there's TV shows that kind of, you know, have product placement, but it's like you feel like it's in some ways it never ends. but almost never begins, right? It's just like you wake up and you're like, wow, what am I going to learn today? What am I going to find today? How's it going to make my life better? And there's also that I think it's an incredibly positive approach. And then because of, the ease of payments, the frictionless aspect there, and the sharing, right? Maybe the three of us all have, kind of store, mini programs or WeChat stores, and that we can then introduce each other. And because, right, our friends know each other, they then share that. It's the ability to kind of grow a brand, to grow an idea is in some ways easier. And there's also this, wonderful sense of discovery. And I always feel that this discovery, this excitement, it was kind of in some ways like the department store of yesteryear, right? Where you would walk through and you'd be like, wow, I'd never seen this product before. Or, it's like in some ways, right? You go to like Harrods in the UK and you're like, there's like people like in some ways, right? If you're in the children's floor, right, popping out of everywhere and like, have you tried this? Have you seen this? And I think that fun, right? That experience, if we want to call it, experiential retail, which really is in so many ways what new retail is, but doing it, kind of in the West where we have, kind of an existing infrastructure and making it work. And once again, it's not about spending money. It's about utilizing the infrastructure we have, to drive top line and take great care of the customer.
It's fascinating to listen to this because I spent 7 years at the Shopping Channel in Canada, which is like a QVC or an HSN, which, as you were saying what you were describing, the goals are, that's the strategy of online 24-hour-a-day televised retail. So that's not new, but the environment of the connectivity around how you shop, where you shop, and of course the personalization is very new. One is a broadcast mechanism that tries to achieve all those things, and others is more personalized. Question for you, since we're just in the China realm, kind of one or two last questions. What we've watched go on in China, both pre-COVID and during COVID, we try to take lessons away from that market as the leading edge of e-commerce, the way they're doing retail. How far can we go in that? I mean, China is a very different market. They've certainly had a very different COVID experience. So, one of the things I think about is how much exactly are consumer habits actually going to change? Their COVID era didn't last very long, so to speak, whereas it could drag on in the Western world for 2 years. I guess to sum it up, my question is: can we learn a lot of lessons from China that can extrapolate to our markets? And where does that start and where does that stop?
From the consumer habits and kind of categories that have found a new, if you will, or increased interest is really anything around health and wellness. That I believe, right, and China was already on that path in terms of seeing an increase in the number of runners, and for the 22 Beijing Olympics, right, this idea of 300 million kind of snow sports consumers. When you think about 300 million, and we have 328 million people in the US, right. That's a big number.
Yeah.
So, but this idea that we were already seeing this, and a lot of it I think is about people wanting to feel better, live longer, healthier, and that it's kind of in the grasp of your hand, right? You just have to work a bit towards it. I think that this other idea around when some of the malls reopened, they reached out to all the tenants, and there was this idea, right? Can you offer free product? What can you do, right, to help us kind of get customers back? And so this idea that, and many of these landlords are from the West. And so it's just this idea, right? We're all going to work together to make this center successful, and even competitors, right? Let's kind of do what we can. And so I think that this idea around the, kind of, partnership ecosystem is truly, kind of incredible. And then, well, and this whole thing, right? We at Coresight developed, our first year, and very much kind of rolled up our sleeves, and it was quite non-techy, just because of the time that it took us we basically took a deck and turned it into a website and had 10, but we had 100 retailers and brands. We had 14 charities, 12 supporting partners, and we put that together in 6 weeks. I don't think I slept for 6 weeks, but what was very interesting in Shanghai, they did an entire event, kind of driven by the city, and it was called 5-5. And so this idea that just let's kind of pull together. Let's have this great event. Let's get people shopping. Let's get people out. Let's, right, this idea. And this idea was, right, let's kind of get back out on the streets and show everyone that we're confident about, kind of going back to the office. And really, I think from a mental health perspective, and also positive talk track, it was great. And it was a lot, I have to say we were very much inspired in terms of 10-10, where I'm like, I know we have to pull shopping earlier this year because we're going to see this significant constraint in the supply chain, and let's call it the last 30 days of the holiday season. So we can pull it forward 30 days. We give everyone more time to shop and retailers time to get their inventories in place and whatnot. And I feel that there was, and we added a charitable component, but it was this idea, right? There was a lot of excitement and fun. And I think that is what we can really learn from, what we've seen in the East and as they've been able to, kind of get to the other side. So from a category perspective, bottom line, health, wellness, anything around that. And then secondly, making shopping really fun and working together to do that. And I think the festivals, and when you think about it, right, a shopping holiday indicates that there's a holiday that somebody, right, and it could be non-denominational, it can be, but that, some people in cases opt in and others, right, feel that it's not their holiday. But a festival, right, that's where we're having fun and we're celebrating, right? I think of, right, go to like the state fair, eating like funnel cakes. And that's like the whole idea around like this festivization of retail. And so I want to very much, it's a fine line, but an incredibly important one, which is why these festivals, kind of from a volume perspective, right? Last year for Double 11, Alibaba had $38.4 billion in sales, and it was over $98 billion for 618, which is their kind of mid-year shopping festival. I mean, that's exponential. And it just shows you, right? As everyone wants to have fun and get out, right? These festivals are a great way to do it.
Yeah, some of those numbers are just really hard to wrap your head around. Well, sadly, Deb, we're going to have to leave it there, but we really appreciate you coming on. We will put all sorts of contact information and probably some links to all the or various pieces of the different work they do at Coresight. I would really encourage people to go check that out because there are many, many areas that we didn't get a chance to get into and many areas that we touched on where you can go into a lot more depth. So thanks so much, Deb. I hope you have a good holiday season and stay safe.
Thanks, Steve. You are always such an inspiration for all of us. And I think Remarkable Retail has really also kind of brought so much of what we talk about with new retail and so many of these other activities to life. And so we in the industry, we can't thank you enough for putting everything on paper and really kind of being our guiding force.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, that was great. And, I don't think I mentioned on mic, but off mic, I met Deborah in Toronto at the store conference where she was a speaker, as you were at the last store event as keynote speaker. So as we think about, in chapter 9, you talk about how retailers are misunderstanding risk. And I think you said the opposite is risky. Can you get into that a bit?
Well, it's not an original point. Certainly a number of people, Mark Zuckerberg has talked about this and others, that if the worst thing you can do in an ever-changing environment, and I would argue in one, as we talked about earlier, that's changing ever more quickly, is not to lean into risk. What ends up happening a lot of times is that, particularly of late, you can actually get so far behind that you can't catch up. So I think a lot of times, particularly big retailers, and again, this gets a little bit to what we talked about earlier of there's this cultural risk of not trying things. But there's also just the reality that if you don't try things, you are going to be left behind. The tendency, I think, is to study and analyze and maybe do only a few experiments as opposed to a lot of experiments. And you become either paralyzed by analysis, worst case, slightly better case, you try a few things, but you've put all your eggs in one basket. I worked with one retailer that did all this studying and ultimately decided to only focus on one thing. We pretty much put all of our budget behind it, and it was a 2 or 3 year effort. And for various reasons, it didn't work out. And there we were going back to the drawing board, so to speak, with 3 years having gone by. And the world had changed quite a lot by then. So you need a portfolio approach, but just fundamentally you need to take more risks because you just may completely miss opportunities and get to this point where you just can't recover from your slowness, I guess, fundamentally.
Let me chase that one down for you a little bit. Is there a point at which brands, retailers, is there a point of no return? In other words, whether it's relevance or execution, is there a point at which you just say, listen, we just can't, it's gone so far, whether it's in the consumer's eye or the whatever it is, that no new management team, no infusion of capital, no brilliant strategic plan from a high paid consulting can turn this thing around. In my past, I was at Hudson's Bay. We had a mass merch Zellers, and we started to wonder, is it got to the point where we just, if we rename the whole thing and relaunch it, we'd be better off than just trying to continue to redefine what the value proposition is or who we are. Is there a point of no return, or is there never a point of no return? You can always have a second, third, fourth life.
Well, absolutely. I think that happens. And one of the things I say later in the book is that quitting is underrated. I think there's often this idea, and it's a broader point than exactly your question. In addition to not understanding risk correctly, we also fail to understand opportunity cost. And sometimes, whether it's an experiment that should end, or it's a business model that has outlived its usefulness, whether you're an investor or on the management team, you would be better packing it in and moving on. Now, having said that, there's always room, or not always, but there's often room for more creativity and a different way of looking at it. I guess I'd say two things that are probably the most common situations. One is if your brand is really perceived in such a way that requires a massive repositioning of the brand, there's very few companies in the history of business that have ever really done that, to get to a totally different place. And the other thing is, if you've got a massive investment in physical assets, or just hard to repurpose assets, department stores being probably the best example.
Well, and there's a Dallas-based one you and I have been talking about for years, waiting for the penny to drop. At what point do you just say uncle? And I have to draw this Canadian example. Target came to Canada with a great flourish. You and I talked about this many times, and said Zellers actually was the mass merchant, and they bought close to half the properties, and literally closed the stores for a year and said, we'll be back. We're going to take our time. We're in no hurry because, we'll be so great basically when we open up that everything will be fine. And it was a disaster. It's a whole separate podcast episode about why it was a disaster. But in the short, it was too much, too soon, too fast. Though I have to give them credit, it didn't feel good at the time because 16,000 Canadians lost their job literally overnight. Target just said, we can't turn this around. We're just going to leave. They probably said to themselves, and you would be at meetings like this, listen, this is going to take 5 years and a lot of money, and it's probably going to work, but it may not work in 5 years. It may work longer because we are Target. I mean, you can see a future. Yeah. It was a pretty bold decision in some ways, and tied up in change of CEOs, so they could they don't have to wear the decision of opening. They can wear the decision of closing. Is that a good example of?
Well, a lot of these things, we talked off mic about some of my perspectives about what Sears should have done differently. And there were certainly a number of things that I know that I saw at the time, but there are other things that I now see with the benefit of 20 hindsight. So, but I think in the Target case, in fact, it's probably pretty similar in a lot of respects to when Sears closed down the mail order catalog. We had a plan to turn it around, but even under the best case scenario, it was going to take an enormous amount of capital. And I don't remember the exact timing, but 5 or 6 years before you'd really see the results of that. And when you looked at the probability of success against all the other things we needed to work on, we just decided really this opportunity cost of what else could we be doing with our time and our money and so forth. So I think that probably was a little bit of Target's thinking. So I think it's very valuable to focus on opportunity cost. I think it's very valuable to articulate, okay, what would have to be true for us to stay in, and how reasonable does that sound? So just going back to the department store perspective, I think you can articulate what sort of sales productivity JC Penney would need to have an adequate return on investment over time. You can also say, well, what scale do we have to operate at in terms of stores and online presence to stay as a national retailer, and what sort of investments would have to happen, and how much share would we have to take away from competition, and how much better would we have to get at what, you could go down this whole chain of logic to say what has to be true for this to be worth investing in. And where I come out on that is that there's enormous change. And that's why I feel like they'll be the world's second lowest liquidation sale, Sears being the first. But, I don't have access to all the information. But I think you have to go through that exercise, and absolutely you can decide that it's best moving on. But to your point earlier, I mean, that's for employees and for vendors and all sorts of partners and communities. I mean, that's a huge huge thing, and it's hard to make those
big decisions. It's a big decision to wear. I wanted to, speaking of big decisions, I wanted to end our discussion today on this interesting idea. We're in the COVID era, and many retailers have gone into protection. Le Chateau actually in Canada here just said, well, I'm going to go right from protection to liquidation. I don't see a future, and no one else does. But others are going into protection, righting the ship and coming out. So this is all kind of history or current events. But my question to you is are we now at a point where you can do that kind of reset and both get forgiveness from all your stakeholders, like your employees, your vendors, and the brand has some forgiveness? In other words, hey, look, by the way, we were in trouble before, but now, with COVID, we're really in trouble, and we're going to take the time and reset, and could be better for the brand, and no one's going to hold them, I won't say accountable, but no one's going to hold it against you that you had to go into protection during the COVID era. So are we in this unique period of time?
I tend to agree. I certainly don't think that being in protection, bankruptcy, or just even going through very public trials and tribulations, major headcount reductions, major store closings, or whatever, that certainly doesn't convey well to your brand image. So for sure, I think that's generally a negative. But because so many companies are going through it, and there is this, say, excuse that's easy for people to understand. I didn't want to use
the word excuse, but it basically can be, right? If it's like, okay. It gets back to your point, though, like less stores doesn't fix your brand problem.
To the extent you got into trouble without some major exogenous factor, presumably you were in trouble because you weren't especially relevant and operating well, and there are underlying problems in the business model. But it also could just be perceived as bad management or maybe a leveraged buyout that went wrong or whatever. But fundamentally, it was like you screwed up, as opposed to this is a really tough world and lots of people got caught up in it. So I do think you get a certain amount of grace. I doubt it's long lived. So, right. So I think and to your point too, you get, from a real estate perspective in particular, but sometimes in other things, you get this get out of jail free card by being able to get out of certain long-term debt and getting out of leases and all that kinds of things. So you can hit the reset button in a way that perhaps you couldn't have before. So I do think it gives you a little wind beneath your wings or something for a bit of time. But I still come back to, when we get to any kind of semblance of normalcy, you've got to fight and win in what is a very competitive market where consumers have a ton of choices. So you still have to get to this remarkable place sooner rather than later. So I think it's buys you a little bit of time, perhaps, but probably not a lot.
Well, let's leave it there, because our next episode is I'm calling it kind of a bridge or a connecting episode, where we're going to you and I are just going to chat about the next part of the season, where we really get into the solutions and your framework. So let's leave it there for now, because that's a great way to kind of leave off the discussion and make sure everyone's wanting for more. So listen, special thanks to Deborah Weinswig for being our guest on this episode of the Remarkable Retail Podcast. Steve, read us out.
If you like what you heard, you can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. We'd appreciate a rating and review, as well as sharing it with your friends and colleagues. I'm Steve Dennis. You can learn more about me on stephenpdennis.com, and be sure to look for me on LinkedIn and Twitter for my latest insights.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast. You can learn more about me on www.meleblanc.co. Have a safe weekend, Steve.
Same to you, Michael.